The purpose of today's webinar is just to introduce people who are not necessarily familiar with all the ins and outs of cybersecurity. If you already are familiar with these subjects, or if you just need a little bit of a touch up, that's the purpose of today. So with that, we can get started. And again, if you have any questions or would like to ask anything about the presentation, please feel free to do so. All right, so what are we going to do today specifically? First, I want to tell you a little story about one of the first wide-reaching cyber attacks that we as a country faced. A few terms and conditions that you may or may not be familiar with already. The problems that we face in relation to those terms, what you can actually do about it, whether it's through support in a company like your IT department or IS department, and what you yourselves can do in the comfort of your own homes, or what you can do to make sure that wherever you are, no matter what devices you're using, you always have some way to browse and work with the internet in a safe way. Also about the problems that we can face down the road, what incidents we've had throughout the past couple of years, and whether or not that's going to be something that we have the means to approach and deal with. All right, so first I'm going to take you back to 2008. On the 1st of October, there was a USB drive, a simple, small little USB drive, found outside of a US military base in SQ Village. This USB drive was recovered, plugged into someone's computer. Some of the details, of course, haven't been released, but plugged into somebody's computer. And upon that connection, a series of files started running. Now, it's not uncommon for this to happen with a USB drive. Usually they initiate to check to make sure you're using the right kind of system, to make sure that the files loaded properly, to make sure nothing was corrupted. But these devices can also be used in a malicious way. They can be used to automatically run other programs, other executables. And that's what happened in this case. Now, this wasn't a computer that was just someone's personal laptop. This was something that was plugged directly into the military's private network. And that network was actually plugged into the US Central Command database. What followed was a 14-day cleanup effort where their networks worked with critical restrictions, 14 months total to get rid of this malicious program, a realized $2 billion in damages, and a lot of people in trouble. The Defense Secretary at the time, William J. Lynn III, said that up until this point, we didn't know that our private networks were at risk. This is a department that has $71 billion in discretionable funds that happen to be forwarded by a $10 piece of plastic. These types of attacks aren't necessarily common. In fact, these are the ones that are generally the most dangerous. Human curiosity is a great thing, but when applied with malicious intent, it can cause financial damage that, again, at this time was completely unheard of. Now, this did set a precedent, a cleanup effort called Operation Buckshot Yankee, which eventually led to the creation of US Cybercom. You may have heard about this in the past couple years. In 2018, Cybercom was actually given the distinction of the 10th Unified Command of the United States. So it's considered a proactive branch alongside the US Armed Forces. The point of telling the story is that no matter how good you think your defenses are, no matter how much money you have backing operations, these problems will arise. It's an inevitability with how much we rely on computer technology. So how can we better approach these things? What can we do about them? Cybercom itself has actually been a very good initiative to get people who are hobbyists with computer technology they started forming groups with the intention of exploiting these vulnerabilities in companies and corporations for the sake of better improving these defenses. And this is actually a subject that we will run back to later in the presentation. So there are a few terms and conditions that everyone's probably heard thrown around, whether it's on the news or with web articles or even in the workplace on the day-to-day. So we're just going to review a couple of those so everyone has a better understanding of what we're actually talking about. So cybersecurity is the name of the presentation today, and it's just an umbrella term for the defense, whether it's proactive or reaction to any malicious attack that is originating from a computing machine. This can be from another computing device like a laptop, a desktop, from a network, from a phone, from a tablet, anything that is considered to be a computing device. Likewise, a cyber attack is a malicious action taken against property that is not owned by the attacker. It actually is legal to use and to try to breach security under certain conditions. But generally, it is done for the sake of testing one's security. You are able to do it in a controlled environment for unnetworked computers, something that is limited to the machine or virtual machine that you're working on. But there are a lot of rules and regulations for how to actually implement those. Unless it's done in a controlled environment without a target or for the sake of research, it is considered to be a cyber attack. And unfortunately, we are seeing more and more of those every day. And even if you are familiar with the way that we do protect from these, there are thousands of these that can hit a company, if not more, in a single day without your direct intervention. A firewall is simply a way to block out incoming data while still permitting outgoing data to work. Traditionally, you would see these with email, for example, where if you have a spam address or a website or a web domain that was listed as spam, something that just sends hundreds of group mass reaching emails to a set of people or an entire company, these generally get blocked outright. And the nice thing is that these firewalls usually have a database that they build upon, which require less human intervention to go out and block. It looks for trends in the email, whether it's from the same type of sender, the same domain, like a Gmail, for example, or if the messages are sent to a large number of people that have the same copy text over and over. They're usually identified as spam, and they will be blocked without having to manually report them to your IT or IS department. An antivirus is kind of similar. Usually they're installed into local machines, and they will scan your computer for irregularities. If a system file, something that works in the background just to make your operating system function, if they notice that something has changed or if it's been updated or someone or something accessed it that shouldn't, they will generally let you know and try to clean that file up. These are very important whenever doing day-to-day computing activities. Sometimes they do not function as intended, where you might have a PowerPoint presentation that you download from a coworker or from a third party, and it might be flagged as having a problem in it because there's a video posted in it that it doesn't necessarily recognize. So these are constantly adapting programs, and they do have some faults, which we will touch on, but they are by and large doing their job. A web filter works kind of the same. Usually you'd hear it as like a content filter or parental blocking. They are meant to outright block certain websites, certain domains. Usually they are set up without manual intervention. If a website has been reported where it will take you from the website you want to be on, send you to a different website, and attempt to download some malicious code, these are usually blocked outright. You can set them to block specific websites, but for the sake of security, they are meant to block suspicious looking websites or sites that could potentially lead you down the road of installs or other kinds of spam like that. VPNs we're going to touch on a little bit later too. Those are virtual private networks, and they allow for a more secure encrypted connection between your computer, if you're on your home Wi-Fi, or if you're in a public place or on a public network, and you need to access something private. Everyone probably has heard of this term, especially given the past year. Working from home has required a lot of us to do the occasional work from home or work outside of the office environment. So these are crucial to maintain security with our networks while allowing us to do our day-to-day tasks. A hacker is simply anyone who wishes to use malicious code in a malicious manner. You have probably heard of these terms like on the news, people that have tried to obtain information and data from a database, from credit cards, from media outlets. We've had a couple of those in the past years. Anyone who intends to do bad with computers. Malware is a catch-all term for any kind of virus, worm, Trojan that is set up to execute malicious code. And again, we keep using the word malicious, but the intent here is that it's being done to take or remove something without authorized access. So we have a question here. Do you think basic included security features that come with Microsoft 365 are sufficient on their own, or should we be doing more? We're actually going to touch on this a little bit more down the line when it comes to user prevention, but Microsoft has used its funds in a very appropriate manner. Nothing, and we kind of touched on this with the story, but nothing will ever completely remove human curiosity from clicking on a bad link or from accidentally overlooking a bad link from a bad email. But 365's encryption is very good for a service that is either free in limited capacity or that you can pay for with the Office 365 suite. Office has done a very good job keeping its encryption up to date. More often than not, if you're using Office on the day-to-day and you notice service will be temporarily down between 11 o'clock and 1 o'clock PM to AM, there's a good reason for it. They generally stay pretty on top of any potential security risks, specifically with like Exchange and their like emails. So they've done a pretty good job on that. We also are going to be talking about phishing emails, what they are, and how we can try to better avoid them in just a minute. Just to finish up here, Trojan horses, any kind of code or website that pretends to be one thing but actually does another. If a website looks like Google, but it actually wants to try to install some kind of executable on your computer, that's generally what these websites are. Sometimes ads are designed to look like the websites we want to go to, and depending on the search engine, those can have malicious intent. Scareware is the term for any kind of program or website or pop-up that intends to scare the target into releasing information. You may have seen these when going from website to website. Sometimes you open an article from the Washington Post. I know they had an issue with this in the past couple months, where you'd be redirected to a site that says, your computer's infected, you will lose all your data, in bold caps and flashing letters. And the ones that can be installed generally use these scare tactics to a greater degree. Sometimes they use flashing imagery. Sometimes they use audio they will take over your computer sound and start playing messages saying that you're in trouble and the FBI has your information. They are intended to get that panic reaction and take advantage of that to actually install worse code. A virus, simply just a term for malicious software, and a worm is similar to a virus. A worm is actually what was used in the previous breach with the Department of Defense. That worm was called agent.biz. That is simply a virus that likes to stay as unnoticed as possible for as long as possible, usually to the extent that it will spread from computer to computer, network to network, before anyone knows what's going on. And by the time it reaches a certain condition, hits a certain number of machines, it'll start executing code, and that's where things get really, really bad. So talking about some of these problems, how do they actually affect us, or where do we see them in our day-to-day work? Phishing is probably the most common type of attack you will see working in the office or checking your emails or just in general. They are very easy to send out. They're very easy to replicate. Faking a domain, so like, again, like a Gmail or an AOL, or if it's, your specific company, is pretty easy to do, pretty quick to send out, and you can hit a large number of targets or marks at once. Generally, they will try to impersonate a trusted source. Like in this example, your university. Sometimes they will look like they're coming from a coworker or a boss. And generally, they will request some kind of information from you. It's common to see credit cards. It's common to see log-on credentials. It's common to get some kind of PO or invoice. And generally, these links look legitimate. They will say, like in this one, myuniversity.edu. My university may not be a real university, but it could say pitt.edu, for example. And if you're quickly looking these over, and if everything looks normal, you might accidentally click it. This is where that bait and switch comes in, where you're actually being redirected to something intending to steal information or cause trouble. There are ways of telling these apart from genuine links or articles. Hover over is a common way to quickly identify it. If you go over the myuniversity.edu/renewal, you might see a pop-up of what that link actually translates to. It should say myuniversity.edu/renewal. If this is a phishing attempt or a bad website, or again, something that's trying to trick you, you will see instead and these are usually different, but something like my link protect dot followed by 200 random characters that just simply do not match what you're going to. The trick here is that sometimes if you want to go to an encrypted website, go to an email archiver, something like that, those will look the same, but the URL that you actually want to go to will be present there. It's a quick way of identifying it, as is going through the sender. Hovering over the sender, it might say John Doe, who might be your boss, but if you hover over the name, you might see that the email domain, instead of being myworkplace.com, will instead be untrustedsource.com. Usually they don't match up completely. Recently, there have been attempts that spoof your domain to make it look like, even if you do the hover over, even if you try checking it out a little bit better, sometimes it will impersonate your actual domain, and those are the really tricky ones that require a little bit different intervention. Spear phishing is a term whenever your target, as the hacker, when your target is a specific group of people. Maybe you want to go after human resources. Maybe you want to go after the IT department. Who better if you want to get a bunch of sensitive information? And that attack is specifically focused on that group, as opposed to everyone in the company or just random targets. Whale phishing is also a common term. That is whenever you're going to attack a high priority target. So again, your IT department, the CEO of the company, the executive board, administrators, anyone who has high priority credentials in that company or institution that could potentially give you a lot of information, or you could use for other nefarious purposes. Some of these emails do break through from time to time. Like, I'm sure everyone that has a work email has probably seen these. They do tend to get blocked in mass. Sometimes the ones for every one you see, there's probably a couple hundred that your web filter already blocked that you never see. And that's a good thing. But again, sometimes these do slip through the cracks. So what's the best way you can protect yourself? Always look over an email before opening it. If you notice that you got an email from your boss, but something seems off, if they're directly asking you for something, you might want to double check to make sure that the sender's legitimate. What they're asking for is something that they would reasonably ask you for. You might want to check to see if the link, if there is a link, is actually the site that it's going to. But more importantly, You should always stop and double check these. And if you have the ability, you should send it to your IT department or tag or CC the person who may or may not be involved in this. So, hey, I got a weird email from you. Is this legitimate? Oh no, this isn't me. It's a phishing attempt. Then it can be blocked. It can be put on the web filter, and similar emails won't be able to come through from the same sender. There is no permanent solution to this, unfortunately, unless you just don't use email. But there are ways that you can better protect yourself, and caution is always going to be the name of the game here. Web attacks are also very common. You might see a pop-up whenever you try to go to a certain website. You might see a website that is listed as like an ad. Well, usually one of the first searches you get when you go to Google or Bing or any website like that. These are websites that are intended, again, to have a bait and switch where it looks like you're trying to go to a legitimate website. You might be trying to search something on Google, or you might be trying to get into your web domain if it's a targeted attack, if someone really wants to go after the company that you work for. And it looks like it's normal. It looks like that you can actually interact with it, but you might try entering your credentials. Those credentials didn't work. In reality, they were sent to the malicious party and you just got tricked. Usually you will see these when you try to click those links in these phishing emails, but they can also happen whenever you're just browsing the internet. They might happen when you first load a web page. This is called drive-by code. Usually when a website loads, it will try to pull a few important things. Usually it'll pull text, it'll pull font formats to pretty everything up, or if there's certain margins that the website has, it'll load ads. And one thing that was really popular up until about this past December, where Java started getting, where Java lost its support and is starting to be phased out, is that Java and XSS, which is cross-site, it is cross-site security, are ways that they would also try to attack your website. So if you had a Java-based video, or ads used to function primarily with Java, they could be purchased for ad space, but those ads could then hijack the website to run malicious code the moment you connect to it. So you try to go to Google, something weird happens, and you instantly get connected to virus.com saying that your computer is under attack. This is something that we don't really see as much of nowadays because we've stopped using these programs. As compatible and as good as Java was, there were a lot of ways that it could be used maliciously. There were a lot of backdoors or other ways to access your computer or programs that were very easy to exploit. But they still exist to a degree, mostly through user intervention or through websites that are designed to look one way and act another. Trojan horses are also very common. It's a term for whenever you go to a download, say you wanted to download Zoom, you accidentally click a bad link or an ad, and it attempts to download something called zoom.exe, an executable. Oh, this looks good. Chances are it's probably not. They pretend to look like the actual thing you want to download or site you want to get to, but in your authorization to download, in your clicking of yes or to run or to install, they will install malicious code instead. The best way to handle those, if you notice any irregular behavior, sometimes a website will pop up with a warning that says your connection is timed out. This is incorrect. Make sure that you're on the correct website. Make sure that you don't click any links, again, that you get in these kinds of emails. If you're just browsing and you happen to be on a news website, for example, err on the side of caution if you see an ad or something that looks interesting. The best advice that I've always been told is if you see like an ad for something like, oh, this wireless keyboard on Amazon looks pretty cool, go to the website directly, and we'll talk a little bit later about secured websites. Go to that directly rather than following links, because that can lead you down a trail of very bad and malicious sites. Viruses. again, a virus is just an umbrella term for any kind of malicious code that runs on your computer. We already talked a little bit about how you get them, but how can you directly identify them? Usually, these are in executable type formats if we're talking about like a Windows computer. These, for Windows specifically, you would see the file extension. So for a text document, it might be doc, it might be txt, it might be pdf. For executables, they're usually in the form of executable, exe, data, dat, or batch, bat. These are applications that can be used for day-to-day stuff. Your Microsoft Outlook is an executable, but these files can sometimes be hidden when they're downloaded to be executable rather than the file type you wanted. If you downloaded a PDF from someone who you thought was a trusted source and you see mypdf.exe, it's not what you're looking for, and it's going to run bad code rather than have a PDF pop up. You can change your File Explorer settings. So with your scrolling through documents, you can change your File Explorer settings so that you can see these file extensions in the name. So instead of my PDF, it would be mypdf.pdf, or in this case, exe. But you can also see them by file type. And with modern browsing, this wasn't a thing back around like the Windows XP era, where if you were to download a file that you thought was legitimate, you wouldn't get any kind of warning unless you double checked before you opened it that it was a different file type. Nowadays, Chrome, Firefox, even Internet Explorer will warn you whenever you attempt to download an executable. It'll say, hey, these types of files can harm your computer. Are you sure you want to download this? Now, it does this for everything, even if it's like Zoom or Microsoft Teams or any other kind of trusted site. Always double check what you download. Always double check what you access. Again, err on the side of caution, because these can usually get pretty convincing if you already are under the assumption you're on a trusted site. We're going to talk about worms a little bit later, but depending on the type of virus you get, they will do different things. Sometimes they will change system files. Sometimes they will change your user access. Sometimes it will give and create an account with administrative access so it can do things with it later. Sometimes it will open up remote connections, which means anyone that has access to this code could access your computer and do whatever they want with it. The worst of these are the ones that don't have an immediate reaction, but will stay hidden for long periods of time, capturing information and processing it. That's actually what we're going to talk about a little bit now, the common types of viruses you'll see. If you see one of these, chances are you've already got an infected computer. Adware is exceedingly common. Usually they are pester programs, which will constantly prompt you to download this or to buy that, or will have pop-ups like the one shown here saying that your computer's infected, you're going to lose everything, the computer's not going to work again, it's going to hit everything. It already is. And attempting to interact with these pop-ups to remove all threats will install more without fail. They are designed to make it look like they have some other intended function. Commonly, you'll see these disguised as antiviruses. There are a lot of good paid and free types of antivirus. Norton is a good one. AVG is a good one. Even open source free ones like Avast have certain advantages, but there are programs that will replicate these to look like they're legitimate and will attempt to confuse and trick you into downloading more malicious code. Spyware and keyloggers. Usually these come in the form of worms, and they are intended just to log whatever you do on a computer. Whenever you enter a keystroke, whenever you put in your username and password, if you send a sensitive email to a coworker for credentials or for a PO, these will all get recorded, formatted, and then sent to a third party. You won't even know that's happening. And again, these can go for very long periods of time, and these are designed to go from computer to computer. If you're at your desk at work and you happen to be connected to the network, it will try to find a way to go from your computer to another computer and basically record everything. Ransomware and scareware do go hand in hand. We already talked about scareware a little bit, but ransomware functions on the same principle. The difference is ransomware will usually restrict your access to do anything. You might download something that appears to be, something you intended to download. Your computer will restart, and then when you log in, you will be greeted with this is actually something that happened to Sony back in 2014. A computer message will pop up. Sometimes they will have flashing imagery. Sometimes it'll do the voice thing saying that you're locked out. We're already downloading your stuff. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's not. Unless you pay a fee, you will lose everything on this computer and will pass this from person to person. These can be the most devastating thing for a company. All it takes is one infected computer for this to become a very costly and widespread problem. Rootkits are also troublesome. You don't hear about these as much, but they change system-sensitive files, like they change how your operating system works to allow for consistent and constant background access. You might be doing something on your computer, you might notice something weird about it restarting, or the scariest one is a pop-up that looks like you're running updates, when in reality, someone in the background is on your computer doing whatever they want with it. Other than the preventative methods we've already talked about, if you're at this point, there's very little you can do out there without any antivirus, and we're going to talk about that. There's very little you can do to approach these kind of problems. If they're already installed, chances are they've already made a backup of themselves somewhere. Chances are they have services running that even if I accidentally downloaded virus.exe, I'm going to delete it from my computer. They might have services running in the background that when you attempt to shut off or restart your computer, they will reinstall themselves. So at this point, prevention kind of goes out the window, and you need something to help rectify these problems. How can you rectify them? What can you do? What is common to see at your company or business that your IT team or your IS team handles? There is a collective term called digital safety protocol. Now, everyone has a different form of this, but if your company has an IT or an IS policy, it is generally a code of conduct for how you will handle business equipment, how you will handle your computer, how you will handle sensitive files or information, and the transfer and movement of those files. Usually this is something you get in like an employee handbook. Sometimes this is something that you need to review, or you will be notified to brush up on annually. But usually it's a set of codes and conduct of how you can better protect yourself. These are things like, if you're on a work computer, make sure that all of your tasks are work-oriented. If you need access to a special kind of program, request access before you download it, check with us to make sure that it's safe, see if there's anything we need to do to help bolster these defenses. If you do notice something that's wrong, it is your responsibility to report it. We can't fix something if we don't know it's a problem. Everyone has made these mistakes at one point in their life. From the mid 2000s to the mid 2010s, even then at that point, we were still trying to figure out how networking could be done in a safe way. We still are trying to figure it out to a degree. If you do stumble across this, honest communication is usually the best way to handle it. I see we have a raised hand. Sorry. Is there a question?
If you had a question and went to try to raise your hand, instead just try to plop it down into the question pod at your bottom bar or the chat, either one. I will be able to see that first, and I can relay it over to Matt. I do not see anything yet, Matt, so if you want to, oh wait, actually.
Oh, there is one.
Yep, just
Do you
got
have any
one.
thoughts about Apple products in general? There was a belief that Apple used to be the most secure thing in the world, which to a degree it was. Different operating systems have different types of code architecture. If you were to make a virus in a batch file that would log everything a user does on their computer and send it to an email, that specific executable would not work on Mac OS. It wouldn't work on an iOS device because Apple doesn't use batch files. They're handled separately. That being said, for a solid decade or so, honestly, before Apple really became popular, it always had that following, but in terms of like when networking became like a really big thing, Apple was a really secure thing to use because, and even this was even without antiviruses or web blockers, because not enough people were using iOS like in a business environment or just in general as high priority targets. This has changed, especially in the last decade or so. Now that Apple has hit mainstream use for companies, for individual work, they have their own set of problems when it comes to security. Most of theirs are specifically application based. iTunes is something that has had its fair share of troubles, but human curiosity and interest is what unfortunately drives these kinds of things. So for a period, Apple was safe, but as soon as people began using it and using it for business and for financial reasons, that's when it became a little less safe. Now, what you have available in OS versus iOS are pretty interchangeable. It does its job. And for the most part, it's down to personal preference or the nature of your work. I also see a question. Can you please let us know about what are the safety protocols? Well, that's a little bit about what we're talking about now. For our company, we have certain things in our handbook set for changing passwords like semi-annually for user programs, for computer access, for the safe handling of your equipment to make sure that it's always on your person whenever you're in whenever you're in an external place. Making sure that whenever you use something at your desk, you make sure that it's locked or encrypted or put away when it's not in use. General safe practices like that. And again, some of them are more common. You might find that if your business handles banking information or does accounting, that some things are a little bit more specific to that company or those types of practices. But there are some just good general rules to follow. And even if your company doesn't require that, it's always good to have some kind of written list to go back to if there are any questions, and you can always expand on it later. But that's a very good question. Just to finish up on this then, password encryption, like I just mentioned, if you have it for a company, usually your company will have restrictions on your password. It needs to be a certain number of characters. It can't be a certain number of repeating characters. You shouldn't use anything super common like days of the week, sports teams, that kind of thing generally is sometimes enforced, sometimes suggested. You want to make sure that it's something that you change semi-annually, usually every 6 months. Some places are every year. That comes down to your business. For personal use, I would recommend probably every 6 months. Even if it's something that you use off the network, you might use your computer for digital art, you might use it for note-taking or whatever else it might be. Good practice is to always try to change it, always try to use something a little bit new. Common sense internet browsing. Again, there's no one set term for this, but to me, common sense internet browsing is only go to sites you trust. Don't download anything unless you are sure it is legitimate. And we're going to talk about how you can tell it's legitimate. Always double check what you open and download. If you have any questions, ask them, especially in the business environment, especially at your company. If you have any questions, there is zero shame in double checking something. Your ITMIS team appreciate it because it might help us say, oh, wait, this is something that's unblocked and this can cause problems. We can take care of it. Or we can just help you say, oh yeah, this is something you might want to watch out for. We can add this to our block list. Thank you for telling us. Like communication, open communication with this kind of thing is the most helpful thing in the world. For a little bit more about like what companies do, usually if it's company designated equipment, they will come preloaded with certain types of security features. Usually they will have their own antivirus and security set on it. Windows comes preloaded with the ability to use BitLocker, which is very important for having restoration if anything does go wrong with your computer. In case anything does hit your system, it allows us to go back and reset things to a little bit more of a secure period. Sometimes that'll prevent data loss, which is very important. And email encryption as well. As previously mentioned, Office 365 has its own set of protocols that are usually pretty good. Some of these are more user-defined. Like again, if you're used to working with certain websites, you might want to whitelist or allow access to some domains. You might blacklist or block certain other domains. But all of this is usually handled on the back end. If you do come across a problem, if you do notice that someone, again, like on a phishing attempt, or someone sends you a bad file, or maybe one of your emails got redirected and it caused a kind of a bounce back, we can make those changes on the back end. So under ideal circumstances, if it's doing its job, you won't even know it's there. The less obvious these kinds of problems are generally indicative of them being handled correctly on the back end, to make sure things are blocked, to make sure that you won't accidentally get bad messages, to make sure that the content that you're viewing is safe and what you're supposed to actually be getting access to.
Hey, Matt, just to jump in, we have another question for you.
Okay.
This one reads, I don't really hear about people getting viruses on phones. Why are phones more protected than computers if they do the same things?
Truthfully, they're not. Modern phones, modern smart devices do have their own set of problems. You might not hear it as much with iOS, because like we just talked about, iOS, for some of like your personal preferences put aside, their infrastructure for their phones and their computers are basically the same thing. You are starting to see Windows devices now, mostly with like tablets rather than smartphones, that have that same kind of encryption features put to it. But then you have things like Android. Android is its own separate operating system that does, just by its very nature, have some exploitable problems to it. The most common thing you'll see with a phone is whenever you're web browsing, those redirects and those like bait and switch websites where you might open, oh, I want to go on YouTube to listen to this lecture. You go on YouTube, and again, there's a YouTube app, which you probably should be using, but you can still get it on like a browser. It might redirect you to a different site saying, hey, congratulations, you won $1,000. Those were really popular back in the late 2000s, those kinds of, oh, you won. We don't really have those anymore, but those do come with their own sets of problems, and 90% of them is going to be website redirects. The other 10% is going to be things downloaded from the App Store. If you are someone who likes to play your mobile games and you want to try a mobile game that's like a bubble popper or something like that, those come preloaded with ads, and depending on the quality of the app, sometimes those ads will have malicious stuff to them. Sometimes those ads will redirect you to download other bad apps. Sometimes the apps themselves have core problems to them. That generally is something that is handled relatively quickly. There's a whole authentication process to get an app registered on the Google Play Store or on the App Store for iOS. And those credentials have gotten better over time. When smartphones first became popular, they were not well regulated at all. And there were just blatant malicious programs that were given the okay to be put on there. So that's something that's gotten better with time. The common trend is that the more problems we face with this kind of thing, the better the response gets. But you still do see it with phones. But at least from the experiences that are like statistically like relevant, most of that is going to come from web browsing. And we're actually going to talk now about how you can make sure that the sites that you gauge or the sites you go on, mobile, computer, whatever, are secured and generally should cause no issues when you use them. So to touch on smart browsing, we're going to talk about things that are there in the background for you to use. You just need to make sure that you're actually doing them whenever you're web browsing. HTTPS encryption, hypertext transfer protocol secured. This is something that's relatively new. It is simply a certificate. Every website has its own certificate for use for registration purposes. This is a certificate stating that the connection that you have between your computer on a personal network, private network, whatever it might be, is making a secured encrypted connection to the remote site. So if you are searching something on a database like Google, or if you are on other commonly used trusted websites, YouTube has it nowadays, Amazon has it. Depending on where you work, if you have a web mail, like web access to your email, usually those will have it as well. And you will see on some browsers a little lock in the top left corner saying secure, and you'll see the HTTPS. Sometimes that is green, or it shows you that it is considered safe, and you can do a hover over and it gives you an explanation as to why it's deemed that. Generally, these websites have fewer issues with Java and XSS redirecting. It's not completely indicative of like kind of like ads and stuff you'd see on these sites, but it is simply there to state that the connection that you're making has an extra level of encryption on it, which means that what you're browsing is a little more safe than just a normal HTTP website. Some browsers will automatically whitelist websites. And again, if you are looking at a website, you see HTTPS, google.com, you can click on that and it will give you a little overview of reviewed states of the site. Like, oh, this has had this kind of protection added to it. These are terms that have been added to it. And this is all publicly available information that is there just to help better put your mind at ease when it comes to going to these types of sites. We already talked about common sense internet browsing. Don't go on anything that could potentially, don't go on a website that doesn't look legitimate. If you think you went to the wrong website by accident, nothing is stopping you from trying again. Going from a search engine, seeing that as like listed as a trusted site, usually is a better way to go. Always err on the side of caution. It's easier to be proactive about these kind of things than to try to clean the mess after the fact. And again, if you download something by accident, if you notice something downloaded itself, never run it, never install it. Let your IT people know where it came from and just get rid of it. That's usually the easiest thing to do. We already talked on password guidelines a little bit. Make sure that if they're self-imposed, make sure that you have passwords that you can remember, but make sure that they're complex enough that they can't easily be cracked. If you are working for a company, usually these are well-known or listed, or someone can tell you what guidelines you need to follow, but use symbols, use alternating uppercase, lowercase, make sure numbers are used, try to keep it a little bit complicated so that it's not something that's just immediately obvious to someone. As the user, you notice something funny, you notice something wrong, you get a weird email, you get something saying that you want $1,000, report it to your IT team or your IS team. Again, we can't necessarily we are as proactive as we can be about these things, but if something does slip through, we need to know about it so we can take care of it. And that should usually make it a little easier going forward. Make sure that you back up and you have files stored in a safe place. Cloud storage is something that has gotten to be very popular. And the encryption for that has also gotten much better over time. It used to be a bit of a gamble as to whether or not your data was being backed up correctly, but with Office 365 and SharePoint and sites like that, or Dropbox too, working on their encryption to make this more safe, they can be used with a greater degree of comfort. So we've talked about some of the problems. We've talked about some of the success stories of how you can better protect yourself and just comments and stuff you can do to make a difference. Have we gotten to a point where we don't have to worry about this anymore? How safe is browsing? How safe is using stuff for work, for day-to-day? What has happened recently? This is still a problem. This is something that's never going to go away as long as we're using computers. Adobe had a breach in 2013 on October 3rd. 3 million credit card accounts were compromised. 38 million users. Account information was compromised. $1 million, which seems kind of low, was the reported cost of the cleanup effort for this. 2014, Sony had a gaming hack as well, I believe in 2010. 2014, Sony Pictures had a hack of their own. This was done by a company, or I'm sorry, this was done by a hacktivist group called the Governments of Peace. This caused I think it was a dozen or so movie scripts to be leaked. Employee information was compromised, credit card information was compromised, funds were stolen, and I unfortunately didn't get a picture of this, but this was one of the most involved network breaches with scareware. They used a still from one of Sony's own movies kind of to mock them, saying, hey, we got this information, you can't stop us. And it came with like 2 paragraphs of threatening text saying, we're going to keep doing this. That was its own problem. That also happened in October. October is a very bad month for hacking, apparently. The 2008 incident also happened to be in October. 2020, World Health Organization had a credential hack as well. A couple million people had their information compromised. And in 2020, again, the Department of Defense had its own data breach, along with 400 of the Fortune 500 companies to various degrees. This one happened in December, though, so it missed October by 2 months. But these are things that are happening every single day. Sometimes you don't know about them until it's too late, like for this most recent one with the Department of Defense. They found the original scripts that caused the data breach in the first place. Those were put on in February of 2019. It went a year and a half. It went over a year and a half, almost 2 years, without anyone realizing what was going on. So there are still a lot of issues that we're trying to fix here, but it's not all bad. Network level defenses have gotten a lot better. Parties like 365, Dropbox, all of that have been getting better. The money that goes into cleaning up these problems also go into research to reverse engineer this code so it can be used for antivirus, so it can be used for encryption to better protect you. Like I said, cloud security has also gotten a lot better. Critical business infrastructure, since that 2008 hack, it's been better regulated for every company, every organization, institute to have some kind of tech plan to make sure that you have dedicated people who can handle these kind of problems on the back end to approach them when they do happen or if something does become a major problem. And computers nowadays, and even smartphones and tablets, are coming with better software built in so the user doesn't have to download anything to help handle these problems. Windows has its own firewall. It has Windows Defender. These aren't the best programs. They are kind of open source. They have public submitted information for detecting problems, but they're better than nothing, and they've been getting better each and every attempt at malicious activity. We also talked about white hat hacktivism a little bit. White hat hacking is ethical hacking, which is done to, usually it is a third party that gets paid to go to a company. They say, here are our defenses, and the hackers say, okay, here's how we broke them, here's how you can fix them, here's how we can help you make them better. It is done proactively so that you can help fix your problems in a controlled environment. These are people who, even as a hobby, like to break into things, but have the ethics to say, we don't want you to have to deal with this and have an expensive problem down the road. Here's what we can do to help you make this better. So just a bit of a review. Yeah, cyber attacks aren't going anywhere. This is something that's going to be a problem as long as we have computing devices, and the more time and the more involved that things get, the better the technology gets, the more problems we're going to have. That being said, you can still take steps to help protect yourself, to help make sure that your company is staying on track if you're an ISIT, and there are protocols you can follow to help make sure that you're doing everything you can to stay safe. Preventing a problem is better than reacting to it, and it is a common phrase, but knowledge is the most important thing here. There are plenty of public resources for checking out hacking attempts, malicious activity, what these companies did, and there are a plethora of resources, just like this webinar, that are out there, complete free access to help you better protect yourself, whether it's for your own information, whether you're at work. There are things you can do to help better protect yourself. The best thing that you can do, again, is to be cautious, be smart. If you ever have a question, ask. Communication is the best tool we have, and it's the best way we can prevent these types of problems from happening in the future. So with that, yes.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, if you are wrapped up,
yes,
we are just going to get, I've already received 2 questions. So I was going to say we can get right into the question and answer. But the first one I have for you, which I actually was going to ask you myself and somebody beat me to it, but somebody asked about, small business here. They only have about 2 employees. Okay. What, in your opinion, do you think is a good antivirus or anti-malware program for them?
That's a very good question. So what it ultimately comes down to is how much money you want to invest in prevention. There are a lot of decent, free, open source, publicly executed, publicly backed antivirus programs. Avast is one that a lot of people use. AVG is one that I've had a lot of good work with, just for my personal equipment. AVG is one that also does have a paid version. You can use them free for as long as you want. Their paid version does have a few extra nice things for it. They do have their own cloud backup for system critical files. They do have licenses available and discounts available if you're doing it for a business requirement. I don't believe they have a minimum user requirement for business stuff. It's per license, but they'd be a pretty good place to start. I know some people have had good experience with Norton as well. I've never personally used Norton, but they're relatively good as well. So truthfully, it comes down to however much you want to invest in this kind of security. Free options are good, but I would highly recommend checking out the most recent updates, because these things change every day. What they provide is different. The features that they have for backing up, for scanning, all of that, it changes almost on a day-to-day basis. For one that's like a stable solution, AVG has been relatively good. So I'd say that they are a good place to start.
Awesome. And then we have one more question. Do we have any international legal system to prevent the breach of threats as of now?
So that's part of what US Cybercom helped standardize. One thing that you've seen recently, with the Department of Defense and the World Health Organization hacks, are that we have relatively good reason to suspect that they are involve the Russian government to some degree. Without getting too into any of that, the name of the executable and like one of like the services that they found is one that the Russians have used before. So international in terms of like that degree, corporate espionage is pretty much a no-no. There are a lot of individual pacts about like spying and what you can and can't do working with third party or with working with other countries. I'm afraid that I'm not overly well read on that. But there is legal repercussion, of course, depending on who they hit, whether it's a company that is local sourced or if it's the government, there are penalties for that. Corporate espionage, to my knowledge, is pretty much universally frowned upon. And I believe that it's handled the same. It's, well, assuming that you can identify who it is, it's handled and treated with the same degree of importance for inside of the US versus other places. So I believe that, I hope that answers your question. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank right now. There was a Security Act that was released in 2018 when US Cybercom became institutionalized. I can't recite that whole thing off the top of my head now, but there are sites that you can find, like government sites, that do talk about like international protocols between for like data protection. So that would probably be a good place to look.
And then also, just a side note, we will be sending out an email following this, or this webinar that will have Matt's contact information on it. So, you know, for really specific questions like that, you can actually look into that a little bit more with him. But we have one more to follow up right now. This person wrote in, church IT consultant talked them into a quote unquote endpoint protection, and they're wondering, what is this? And they said the consultant said it's only available through them.
That's not necessarily true. Maybe their endpoint protection is only available through them. The term, when I hear endpoint protection, the description that I'm familiar with is endpoint protection simply means anything on the user end that requires some degree of backed intervention. So if there's any issues you have on your specific machines, anything on the user level, generally that refers to endpoint protection. That's something that they might have their own protocols for handling your equipment for security purposes, how they access your machine. All of those are probably done their specific way, but that's a bit of a misleading title. Any kind of antivirus you will find, again, like Norton has its own type of endpoint protection. It's a bit of a generalized term. So I mean, if you are looking for anything that has a professional handling problems directly on end user machines, so like you and your staff, that's generally what it refers to.
Then I'm going to ask this just to give anybody an opportunity to throw in some kind of final questions for us before we wrap up here. But just to recap on the, the point of prevention over reaction, if you had to summarize just 3 rules of thumb for anything from like a very small business or somebody self-employed all the way till maybe Donnelly-Boland, for example, a company that has over 100 employees, what are like 3 rules of thumb that you would try to really drill into employees to be like second nature just for prevention?
Don't write down sensitive information anywhere. Some people think it's a good idea to have credentials written down, even something like your username on a Post-it note. It's generally better to not have that anywhere that's easily accessible. If you really insist on having your credentials put somewhere, it should be local on your machine. It should be in an encrypted file that is also password protected. Every Word document has the ability to have a password put on it. And depending on the type of security programs you have, you can encrypt those files as well, or you can put them in a zipped folder, which again, if you have a Windows machine, there's a way to do it on iOS too, but if you have a Windows machine, you can zip things. You can have a password put on that as well, and those carry Windows encryption. Try not to write that information down anywhere, because if you lose it, it could easily get in the hands of someone who has ill intentions. Don't write credentials down if you can avoid it. And if you are someone who works with a lot of programs, if you're someone who has 20 character passwords, that's not unheard of. It can get daunting, but you need to resist the urge to take the easy way of storing stuff. You should have a password on your password, basically. That would be number one. Number two, if you have a problem, communicate it. If you think something's from a bad source and you can't verify it yourself, ask for help. If you don't have an IT or an IS department, the internet can be one of the best places to find people with similar problems. If problem creator 123 has a web domain, if that is their web domain, you can search that domain and other users will submit their problems. There's a good chance that they will submit their problems or flag this as a bad site on any search engine. Stack Exchange is one really popular website for like computing. There are other versions of it that exist for like other like fields of study, but for their computer science, IT and IS field, there is more user submitted warnings than basically any other site. There are plenty of free resources that you have if you don't have an ITIS department. If you do, send it to them, forward it to them saying, hey, here's what this is. Here's what I did with it. What should I do? They will take care of it from there. If they need any more information, they'll press you for it, but that should usually be where that ends. So report when you have a problem. There's no shame in accidentally clicking something. I'm sure everyone's had that happen once or twice. And if you've caught your mistake, great. If you didn't catch your mistake, there are people here more than happy to help you. So communication, extremely important. Number three, smart browsing. You are going to use the internet for 95% of what you do, most likely, or an overwhelming amount of the time. If in the work environment, make sure that you are staying on sites that are backed with that HTTPS encryption. If you need access to a new website, look into it a little bit. Try to use your best knowledge to see if it's legit. And again, if you have any questions like, oh, hey, this third-party provider sent me to their website and it looks a little strange. Can you like look into this for me? Your team will take care of it. Again, that's what they're there for. So try to avoid local credentials. Be smart about how you store your passwords. Communicate your problems and safe browsing. Those are probably the most important things you can do. And that's what triggers most of these problems in the first place. Again, human curiosity is a great thing, but sometimes it can have some ill thought out side effects. So use your best guesses and use the resources you have to make it easier for yourself and to help avoid these problems in the first place.